In 2007, 2 young girls went to go study abroad in Perugia, Italy, and one of us survived the experience. So I'm incredibly grateful and lucky to have been the one who got to go home and survive, the one who lived. I've described it before as feeling haunted by Meredith, not in that bad way that people sort of project onto me, more in this this benevolent spirit who is reminding me of the value of life and the privilege it is to live. There's this moment that I see a lot in true crime, especially in wrongful conviction stories, where you tell the story of the crime, you tell the story of the trial, you tell the story of when they got out and the first hamburger they ate the minute they got out of prison, and then curtains go down and they say, end of story. And I think that, in fact, that's really where the story of this person's life begins, is that suddenly they find themselves not having to prove their innocence to the world. Now what? And also, what do I do about the fact that I just lived through that? As someone who went into prison, I was very aware of what it felt like to have your freedom taken from you. And I did have this idea in my mind while I was in prison of, I just fantasized of being able to get my life back. And I kept thinking, you know, I'm living this somebody else's life by mistake, and I just want to go back home, eat some sushi, and be an anonymous college student again. And when I came home, I was rudely awakened to the fact that that life no longer existed for me. Not just because of these external forces like, you know, paparazzi chasing me down the street or stalking where I lived or receiving death threats, all of that. It was the fact that I had changed. I could no longer be, you know, anonymous college student Amanda Knox, because I was the girl accused of murder, and that was my legacy, and I had to grapple with that. And it led to me feeling at first really isolated and ostracized from other people, and it led to me making some really horrible mistakes, which I think is an interesting insight into how trauma has these ripple effects, right? Like, one young man's decision to break into my home turned into him raping and murdering my roommate, and then turned me into an indirect crime victim, and then a victim of the criminal justice system, and then it just ripples out, and I made mistakes that were informed by that trauma. And then I had to find my way and realize that what I was experiencing was a human drama, this drama of trying to figure out who you are and where you belong in the world, who you belong to, and what is your purpose. And discovering that has been incredibly powerful for me, but I think also it's made me feel like I can relate to people again after I had been so pushed away and villainized. Waiting to be Heard is the story of what happened to me. Free is what I have done about it. Over the years, I have had to process everything that happened, and I've realized that this really extreme and isolating experience that I went through actually connects me to people in really surprising ways, because the challenges that I faced, while they are extreme and not unique, but, you know, not very common, have these like lessons about the world and about living and about survival that are universal to everyone. It's the story that people didn't expect would matter, or that they wouldn't expect from me. It's not me defending myself. It's me saying, this is who I am, and this is what I believe. One of the big threads in Free is my relationship with my prosecutor, Dr. Giuliano Mignini. He was the one who portrayed me as this girl gone wild who out of the blue murdered her roommate, and his choices rippled through my life. As a victim of his choices, one of the questions that I just was plagued with was why? Why? Why me? Why you? What was happening here that you saw in me the devil? I never like set out to forgive him. I think that's like an important point to make, is I'm not a person who's like faith, for example, compels them to forgive, right? Like that was not my goal. My goal was to understand him. what I discovered over the course of reaching out to him and then talking with him and then meeting him, I found a real person, not a boogeyman. And as soon as I saw that, I could empathize with him. And as soon as you empathize with someone, you have compassion for them. I went from being a pawn and powerless in his story and him having all of this agency over my well-being. As soon as we met, that flipped, and I realized that his well-being relied on me all along, and that of the two of us, I was the one who held all the power. That shocked me. Like, I still get goosebumps thinking about it, just like how did this person who had such a huge impact on your life become this gentle, fragile thing in your hands? And how did I inadvertently do that? Like, it's not even like like forgiveness is a natural consequence of like realizing how fragile and precious another human is. Like, I immediately sort of stepped into like mom mode, and I was like, I'm not just forgiving you, like I'm holding you. Like, I care about you. And that changed everything. And like, suddenly I went from feeling like utterly powerless to a superhero. And no one could stop me. And that has felt so good. That is being free. I was the kind of person who just assumed that bad people go to prison and it's that simple. And of course, I was very rudely awakened to realities, and not just realities abroad, but also coming home. My mom noticed that I was really struggling to process, and I was holding a lot in that I didn't know what to do with. And so my mom made the decision that whether I liked it or not, I was going to attend what's called the Innocence Network Conference, which is a once-a-year event with all these different projects that work on innocence cases come together, and they bring their exonerees. And this was during a time when I was still on trial, so I was very wary of people. I was very wary of crowds. I hated being around strangers. I felt so utterly uncomfortable. But my mom sort of pushed me through, and I was introduced to a world of people, and they were so kind to me. I'll never forget two things that people said to me during that first conference. One was walking through those doors, two men came and embraced me and said, "You don't have to worry about a thing, little sister. We know." And like realizing that they knew that the thing that I felt was that anytime I entered a room, I had to explain myself to people. It wasn't like I couldn't just be a person in a room. I was a person in the room who had to justify myself being there. They made me feel like I belonged somewhere for the first time, and then to realize that they had spent way longer in prison than I had, and that there was problems here in the US as well, really put my own experience into perspective. But then the other thing that they told me was, "Thank goodness you were wrongly convicted, Amanda." And I was like, "What?" And they were like, "No, because before you got wrongly convicted and it made the rounds of the world, people didn't really believe that it was happening. And so thank goodness. I mean, sorry for everything you went through, but like, thank goodness you're here, because it's because of you that so many people now believe that this is a real problem." Gratitude is one of the biggest feelings that I have coming out of this experience. People think that I'm angry all the time, or that I don't trust the police at all, or at least think that I'm justified to feel that way. But I think that I and a lot of exonerees would surprise you by being actually really well-grounded and really desiring to make peace with the rest of humanity despite everything that we've been through. Recently, I've been trying to clear my name of this last final charge that I was convicted of in Italy, and I failed. The Supreme Court ruled against me, and very likely that is the last chance that I had to fully clear my name. And I was clearly struggling with it, right? Like, I was not unmoved. I was not so zen that I was unmoved by it. I was sad, I was angry. And when I am experiencing those emotions in relation to what's happening, I allow myself the grace of feeling those feelings and not judging myself for them. And so for me, like, the way that I can think about all of these things and not stay angry is remember that so much of what happened to me was not personal to me, right? Like, the person who they accused doesn't exist. That Foxy Knoxy Amanda Knox person doesn't exist. It is literally a figment of other people's imagination, and that's who they wanted to put in prison. And I think that that's a really good lesson just for people in general, because I think we're all tempted to get into everyone else's mind and clear things up and say, no, I'm not that person that you think I am. And we can't do that. And also the idea of who we are doesn't really belong to us anyway. It's a collective piece of property. Who I am, because it belongs in other people's minds too, is as much a product of their mind as it is my actions. I don't know how I got lucky to end up with Chris, because it's kind of outrageous how well matched we are. I was writing for a local paper doing arts correspondence, and I reviewed his debut novel, War of the Encyclopedists, for my local paper. And I loved it. I wrote a rave review, and I submitted it to the paper, and that was gonna be it. I wasn't planning on doing anything about that. But then the next day, serendipitously, I walked out of my apartment and saw in the diner window across the street a poster for a book reading for this exact book that I had just reviewed that night at my local bookstore. And I thought, wow, that's serendipitous. I never go out in public, but it might be fun to go to a little book reading. Like, can't be bad. No one will notice me there. Well, of course, I walk into this book reading, and of course, everyone notices I'm there, and there's whispers, but I get over it, I sit down, and I enjoy this book reading by this very, like, fun-looking guy with stripes carved into his beard, and his best friend they wrote the book together, and I just thought, wow, they're fun. I interviewed them for the paper, and that interview turned into, like, drinking scotch and watching Star Trek, and I don't know, like, I just came away from that encounter being like, wow, can I just meet people and make friends in the world like a normal person in the world now? And so he became one of my first friends after all of that was over. And I think the thing that really distinguished him was how not interested he was in the worst experience of my life. Like, he did not go down the Google rabbit hole, and he did not ask me questions about it. He'd be like, oh, what movie do you want to watch? And I'd be like, oh, I don't know. And he'd be like, how about WALL-E? I haven't seen that in a while. And I was like, what's WALL-E? And he's like, what do you mean, what's WALL-E? That's an incredible movie. Where were you when you did, like, this movie was huge? And I was like, I was probably in prison. And like, so like things like that would come up, and you know, I would maybe talk about it, but it wasn't like the focus of our interactions with each other. We were just getting to know each other as people. And so he gave me the grace and the space to just be a person and to be a flawed person. Because like, one of the burdens of being accused of a heinous crime is that you feel like you have to be perfect just to prove your innocence every single day. And for him to give me the space to be not perfect, to make mistakes, to be angry, to be sad, to be crying in a closet, to be rude and grumpy, like, he gives me that space to do that and to be a person. And it's been so healing for me. And I feel so lucky. When I first came home, and for the years that I was on trial still, I could not go out my front door without justified paranoia that I was being followed, and that potentially someone was trying to harm me. That was really a scary and very difficult and isolating time of my life. That time of my life, thankfully, is over. I get to have friends. I get to go to the grocery store. At the same time, though, as soon as I became pregnant with my daughter, I was very, very afraid for her immediately. Just prior to that, I had gotten married, and it had been years since the trials, and nothing was really going on, and yet people showed up outside of my my wedding venue that I very specifically kept very secret and very tied down so they could take pictures of me and my family members. So, and then of course there's that like headline or that subtext of, look at Amanda living her life while a Meredith is dead. Like there's always that idea of like my identity is attached or inextricably linked to her death. And so any expression of life in my life is seen or perceived as a kind of offense to the memory of my friend who got murdered. And the last thing that I wanted for my daughter was to feel like one of those things. I did not want the first instance of my daughter's existence into this world be a headline like, Amanda gives birth to daughter, ... you know who will never get to have a daughter, Meredith. Like, that is not fair. It's not fair to me, but it's not fair to my daughter. That is not what her existence is about. Her existence is not living in the shadow of the worst experience of my life. And I didn't know what to do. I panicked about it. And my husband and I really thought hard about how we would not just introduce my story and my journey to her, but also how we would introduce her existence to the world. And, you know, like that, like just like we had thought, as soon as we announced in our own way through our podcast Labyrinths that I was pregnant and my daughter existed, we were messaged by people who said, I hope your daughter dies so that you know what Meredith's mom went through. That's one of those ongoing things that that also sort of pushes back against that why can't you move on question of like, well, it'd be nice if the world moved on too. I love writing. I love being a mom. One thing that I would love to be a bigger part of my life is comedy. So I love comedy. People just don't usually think of me in comedic terms because I am associated with a tragedy in their mind, and a lot of the work that I do is very much either advocating for criminal justice reform or writing about some really like deep, hard, difficult truths, because again, that's like my pedigree, that's what I know. But like the absurdity of life and talk about how to get through things. Like one chapter I have in my book is entirely devoted to humor and what it means and why it's such a powerful influence in my life. And so what I want to do is I want to write a stand-up comedy special. So stay tuned for that. I do feel like I have lived two distinct lives and that a part of me did die in Perugia, and that I'm living a whole different life now. I've been reborn, but I am still informed by that past and by that trauma. I'm so lucky to be alive right now. I am so lucky to be able to tell my story. I'm so lucky to have children. Like, women who get wrongly convicted typically do not get out in time to have children. Like, it is bonkers how lucky I am.